Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Ryan Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. Kapka Kassabova writes about marginal places and the interdependence of humans and animals in traditional societies. In her last 4 books, she has made the Balkans her subject, a region I love visiting for its rugged geography and its people. She explored the story of her own family's past in Border, A Journey to the Edge of Europe, and in To the Lake, her book on Lake Ohrid in Macedonia. Her next 2 books dealt with the societal level, how people in this corner of the Balkans connect with the natural world, the world of plants in Elixir, and the world of animals in her newest book, Anima, A Wild Pastoral. I think she's one of today's most interesting writers on place, and one whose work will stand the test of time. We spoke about nomadic pastoralism as a vanishing way of life, the interdependence of humans and animals, and what it's like to live as a shepherd in a vertical world. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about my new book. It's called A Sunny Place for Shady People, and it's about 6 years I spent living in Malta. Most people know Malta as a tourist destination, but there's a lot more happening below the surface, some of it quite dark. I moved there to write a breezy island book inspired by Lawrence Durrell, but I watched an organized criminal network take over the government of a European Union member state with the widespread support of its citizens. It culminated in the car bomb assassination of a writer I admired, the journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia. A public inquiry implicated the office of the Prime Minister in her murder, but nearly 7 years later, very little has changed. A Sunny Place for Shady People is available now from Trinity University Press and booksellers everywhere. One of my own favorite writers, John Gimlet, described it as exquisitely researched, deftly rendered, painfully revealing, and important. I hope you'll check it out. And now, here's my conversation with Kapka Kassabova. So your new book is dedicated to the humans and canines who still practice pastoralism. Could you define the term for those urban dwellers who aren't familiar with it?
Well, pastoralism is quite a broad term. It could be anything from nomadic living with animals to taking your grazing animals out every day, a short distance, and then returning with them. But the key to pastoralism is the synchronized movement of humans and grazing animals, and almost always guardian dogs. And how that's executed depends on the type of pastoralism, the type of landscape that you live in, the resources you have, the needs of the animals, even the breed of the animals. All of this is something I learned on the hoof, as it were.
Well, could you say something about that landscape, your specific setting for this book in the Pyrenean Mountains?
Anima is set on the west side of the Pyrenean Mountains, which is quite a large mountain chain in the southwest of Bulgaria, bordering Greece and the Republic of Macedonia. It's a kind of layered mountain in the sense of it's terraced, in terms of climate and soil and biospheres. So it starts at the Kresna Gorge, at least, the setting that we find in the book starts at the Kresna Gorge, which is actually, an ecological sort of paradise. It's a protected area where some species survive that don't survive in the rest of Europe. Because of its positioning, because of its geography. And the Kresna Gorge is very sandy, so that the bottom sort of terrace of this mountain is sandy soil. And then you get to the highlands, which is where, many of the highland villages are set. A lot of them are empty villages now, but traditionally, or semi-empty, traditionally that's where people lived with their animals. And then the top is pre-alpine and alpine. And the Pyrenean Mountain is actually a continuation of the easternmost part of the alpine range. So if you imagine the Alps, it's like the Alps, but at a smaller scale.
I think it's also the southernmost glacier in Europe as well, isn't it? In at the top of Mount Viren. I remember seeing snow there even in midsummer.
Yes, yes, like I did. I think we saw the same glacier. You saw it from the top where you climbed, to Wicheren or Thunder Peak, and I saw it from the alpine pastures just below that peak. And I wondered, looking at it, is this an actual glacier? It's quite small, but and then I looked it up, and yes, it's the last surviving sort of mini glacier.
So you mentioned deserted villages or abandoned villages. You said in the book that there were four cataclysms in the last 100 years that led to the end of nomadic pastoralism in this region. And one was, I wanted to talk about those briefly. One was the drawing of new borders.
Yeah, the drawing of new borders refers to World War One, followed by World War Two, and the upheavals that happened around that time with new arising nationalisms and new nation states drawing borders, mass migration, of course, of you know exiled peoples, because of ethnic cleansing around World War One. So these new borders were pretty much, at the start of the 20th century, marked pretty much the beginning of the end of large-scale moving pastoralism. They kind of made it very difficult and ultimately impossible for the oldest surviving pastoral nomads of Europe to continue doing their work, and they are the Karakachans. The Karakachans, who were, a culture, and they nobody knows quite how old that culture is, but they were sort of an animal nation. They were an animal nation, the last animal nation of Europe, and they moved typically between the Aegean plains of Greece and Macedonia to the north into the Balkan mountains of Bulgaria. The Balkan mountains in general, but specifically the Bulgarian mountains like Pirin, which is featured in the book, but also Rila and the Central Balkan Range in Bulgaria, and that is where they spent the summer with their animals. And so the Karakachans were border crossers, for centuries of non-existent borders, if you like. In fact, even their name Karakachan means black fugitives in Turkish. And they were dressed in black because they wove their own clothes from the wool of their black sheep. They bred a particular type of sheep. They came to be known as Karakachan sheep, which are small, sort of small black, brown, sometimes white, off-white mountain sheep. All their breeds of animals were superbly adapted to mountain living. They also bred a type of horse known to this day as the Karakachan horse, and perhaps most important of all, the Karakachan dog. And that is the last of the animal people who stopped moving between borders as these borders hardened progressively. And of course, after World War II, the hardest of all borders came down. That was the Iron Curtain. And that kind of large distance pastoralism that they practiced came to an end. It continued on a smaller scale, and this is what my book explores: the smaller scale pastoralism that's left.
So this closing down, this closing of the Iron Curtain also brought about collectivization, the other great cataclysm. So what did that mean for shepherds and livestock owners in Bulgaria?
Collectivization or nationalization was essentially the theft by government agencies and government businesses, agro businesses, of all private property, including animals, including livestock. And it was a massive cataclysm, for individuals, for families, for communities, and ultimately it changed the face of the land. It changed also the psyche of people. It was a traumatic event that, in fact, was a process rather than an event. It took place over a decade because there was resistance. What happened was I describe how it feels to be in a place like Orelek, this highland village where the book is set, which is an empty village with just, actually just one family living there full time, with a large flock of Karakachan sheep, dogs and horses. And it feels like, it's a ghostly landscape. And this is the legacy of collectivization in the 50s. And how it felt, if you were a pastoralist, and most people in that region were pastoralists, i.e. they owned grazing animals, how it felt was, it was an assault, and your animals were forcibly taken away. Maybe you were left with a few. Maybe you were invited to become part of a sort of a collective business where you saw your animals join, the collective. But the psychological effect was brutal, because these were people who, for generations and centuries, had defined themselves, through pastoralism and through working with the land. So the most dramatic event, and I describe this in Anima, came in the 50s. It came, and it happened to the Karakachans, to the last of the animal nation, who were still moving around seasonally, without a fixed abode. They had summer huts and winter huts, and they were still performing, their ancient way of life, but on a small scale within Bulgaria. So they would be, over summering in, say, Rila Mountain, the high pastures of Rila Mountain, and overwintering down in the plains. So, smaller distances, maybe, I don't know, 50, 100 kilometers, which was small compared to what they used to, the landscape they used to cross, the distances. So in the 1950s, the communist authorities cracked down on the Karakachans. They literally just stopped them on the road as they were moving with their flocks. And they moved as communities, as entire communities. The luggage was carried by the horses, large numbers of horses. Women and children went with the horses, loaded with their luggage, and the men went sort of separately following the pastoral trail, often at night, in fact. The men and the sheep, went separately. That's the traditional Karakachan way. And when the authorities cracked down on them, they took the sheep away, they took the horses away, and the humans and the dogs were orphaned in that way. And in an amazing kind of poignant episode, the dogs, who of course were used to following those trails seasonally, the dogs were disbanded. They no longer had a job, they no longer had a purpose. Like the humans, in fact, the humans were forcibly sedentarized. That was the operational term, sedentarized, forcibly settled. But the dogs, were not taken care of. Some of them were shot, just murdered. And the surviving dogs continued following the pastoral trails. They went south, spent some time, they traveled in sort of bands of dogs. And then a few months later, they went back north. Without the people, without the sheep, without the horses.
That's amazing. That's such a statement of the interconnectedness of this culture. In robbing the people of the culture, the dogs carried it on in a sense. That's amazing.
Absolutely. The dogs are key. I discovered that these dogs, without them, pastoralism, and this is probably true of all pastoral cultures, without guardian dogs, pastoralism would be difficult, if not impossible. We're talking about pastoralism in a relatively preserved environment where you have predators. Obviously, in a broken ecosystem, you no longer have large predators. So in Scotland, for example, where I live, in the Scottish Highlands, there's lots of sheep farming still, but it's within enclosures. And anyway, the predators are long gone, the large predators. So there's no more need for dogs. And here in Scotland, the traditional livestock guardian dog is the border collie. So you still see collies here because they're traditional, but they no longer have a job. Occasionally, some farmers keep collies, and it's really nice to see border collies sort of still herding sheep from one enclosure to another, and they're so happy, at work because everybody needs a project.
It's funny how deeply that instinct is bred into them too. I had cousins who had a border collie, and I would stay at their place sometimes, this cottage in the Laurentian Mountains in Quebec. And every time you would get up and go to get a drink from the kitchen or a coffee or something, this border collie would immediately get up and start herding you. Like he would nip at your heels and push you in a certain direction that he wanted you to go. And it was never towards the kitchen where I wanted to go. But it's amazing.
Yeah,
He had never worked in this trade in any way. Just the instinct was
yeah,
there.
it's amazing. And I guess that's just, hundreds and sometimes thousands of years of evolution. And, after my experience with Anima, coming back to the lower world, as the pastoralists call it, the higher world and the lower world, I now see dogs differently. It seems wrong to me. It is wrong to keep a dog in an urban environment without a purpose. Dogs are not meant to be pets.
Hmm.
Um,
So to come back to the four cataclysms before I forget, the last of these was the end of collectivization. It ushered into a period of privatization, but things didn't get better.
yeah, privatization was the next blow, really, and it was pretty much fatal. Collectivization was not a fatal blow to pastoral culture because pastoral culture still went on, but in a different structure, a kind of monolithic structure, industrialized structure, and industrialized ethos under communism. Just like industrialization had taken place in Western Europe, quite a bit earlier, it took place in Bulgaria and the rest of the Balkans at this time, in the second part of the 20th century. The Balkans were late industrialized. And that is a good thing for nature. So pastoralism did go on under communism, and the fatal blow, in fact, did come with privatization, which meant the reversal of collectivization, but in a sort of arse about face way, which was really brutal, and it was part of the general free fall of society and the economy, accompanied by mass immigration. I'm talking about the first sort of decade after the collapse of communism in 1989. So through the 90s, there was this sort of chaotic, pastoralism, farming was agriculture, everything to do with the land was in a chaotic state. And it was at that time that some flocks were disbanded or even slaughtered, butchered, in abattoirs because they no longer, all the structures had collapsed. The structures that communism had held in place had collapsed. But there was nothing new to come in to replace them. And this is where the story of Anima begins. This is where I sort of started taking an interest in this subject, knowing very little about it. Because I kept coming across, on my travels in the highlands of Bulgaria and elsewhere, in Macedonia, Greece, Albania, I kept coming across people with animals who were still holding on to that way of life, and were obviously struggling. Sometimes entire families, and I was fascinated. I've always been fascinated by the Highland way of life, mountain living, and to me, mountain living is very much about the living web, humans and animals, and wild animals and domesticated animals living together, and how that web coexists. The hum of the living web has always fascinated me since childhood. So coming across these people, I just wanted to spend more and more time with them, just to find out what it's like to have a flock of sheep, with these guardian dogs. And inevitably there were Karakachan dogs, that breed of mountain dog, And I ended up, I wrote an essay about this family of, Muslim Highlanders. It's not important that they were Muslims, but they were part of a Muslim community in a place called Yakuruda, a little town at the foot of the Rila Mountains in Bulgaria. And I just spent a couple of days with them, really, and was completely just sold into this way of life, while at the same time seeing how hard they worked for little money. Because really they make a living from subsidies. If you have rare breeds or protected breeds of sheep, you can get subsidies, and from any milk that they got from the sheep and made into cheese and sold locally, which is seasonal income, and it's not much. So you've got to love it. You're in it for the love. And I was just inspired by this particular family, because it was a young guy trying to sort of continue the tradition, a guy in his 30s, and his wife, and they had a little child, and they were like, we don't want to emigrate like most people to make decent money abroad. We want to stay here because we love it here, and we want our children to grow up in nature, and the grandparents are here, and we love the animals, and we love the dogs, and they were into breeding Karakachan dogs. And that's how my fascination kind of evolved, from just sort of a curiosity to, I want to live this life, experience this life for a while, and write about it. And that's how Anima began.
This interdependence is really interesting. Like, we're often told to think of humans as a scourge on the planet, but we seldom seem to understand how interdependent we are with other creatures. Like you said, that the changes in Bulgaria that we talked about moments ago didn't just end a way of life; it ended entire breeds of animals. Entire breeds of animals also went extinct. That hadn't occurred to me before reading your book.
Yes, it hadn't occurred to me either. And when I actually looked into what these Karakachan breeds meant, how these breeds had come about, and how this family that I sort of I spent time with in Anima, how this family had set about rescuing this breed or restoring it, to back to health in the 1990s. They're my generation, so they were 20 when they started this incredible project of regeneration of the Karakachan dog and then the Karakachan sheep. They were, with no money. They were just passionate about the dogs, the sheep. They were passionate about animals, and they had realized early on that the dog and the sheep are interconnected, and the horse as well, and that if one disappears, so will the other. And they set about on this incredible sort of rescue mission. It evolved, it started off small, as these things do, and it evolved. And as they went around sort of visiting mountain communities in Bulgaria and neighboring Macedonia, looking for, this mountain breed of sheep and dog, they realized it was on the brink. And they were meeting the last of the animal people, the last of the real shepherds, living in dire poverty, often clinging to their precious livestock. And it's a kind of we can describe it as a sort of DNA bank, a breed of animals that is under threat. It's a sort of DNA bank that's very precious. And biologists, and I learned this from living with these people. One of them is a wolf expert, one of Europe's wolf experts. She's a biologist, and biologists talk about indigenous breeds as a DNA bank, in those terms, but also they talk about indigenous breeds as opposed to hybrid breeds or specially bred industrial breeds, in terms of vitality. So the word vitality, vital, is interesting here. Because when you are living with indigenous animals who are living to their full purpose, like the Karakachan dogs, looking after the sheep, you experience their vitality. And you also experience the other meaning of vital, which is life-saving or essential, that without these indigenous breeds, the ecosystem collapses, and then all we have is the artificially bred breeds of, for example, highly productive milk-giving sheep or meat-giving sheep, which is, of course, larger. Everything that is artificially bred by us humans tends to be larger, more productive, more synthetic, and ultimately less adapted to its environment. In fact, not at all adapted to its environment, because it's not supposed to survive in a natural environment. It's supposed to be kept prisoner, in a manufactured industrial environment to produce for us.
You could be describing our own culture.
Absolutely. This is the culture we have created for ourselves and for our, and for animals. It's a monoculture. It's a boring culture devoid of vitality. And I guess one of the things that I experienced that was addictive, it was the addictive quality of this life. It's also a very hard and brutal life, and there's nothing romantic about it, but the addictive quality of it comes from this vitality of the living web, that you are plugged into it. There is constant movement. There is always something happening when you live with animals. And it's the same if you're doing stationary farming. Farmers never rest. There's always something happening in the morning, Someone has given birth, or something is happening over here, someone has sort of jumped the fence, or it's got a thrill of its own.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the life of a shepherd. So you experienced it at firsthand. Well, first of all, the obvious question, how on earth does one person move and direct hundreds of sheep? That's incredible.
Yeah, it's incredible. It seemed to me almost at the beginning, it seemed to me like magic. It reminded me of the Pied Piper, a single whistle, from the shepherd, and 600 sheep follow. That's magical, I thought. And then I saw, what's involved in the skill, the shepherding, the skills of being a shepherd. It's a dying profession. It's a dying craft. We were talking about endangered breeds of animals. Actually, the shepherd is an endangered breed of human. And, it's interesting that the more I sort of learned about shepherding, because I was tagging, from the beginning, I was tagging the hired shepherd of that family in Orelek. This is the highland village where this is set. I was tagging him and spending long days with him in this large flock of sheep and about 10 dogs that came along every day. So, he would take them out, as they say, right at 8 o'clock in the morning, time to take them out. And we take them out and we spend the day with them, and it can be an 8-10 hour day. And then in the evening, we take them home or we take them down. And I learned, what's involved in shepherding, and it's a dance. It's all about body language and being synchronized, and understanding the sheep. It's about understanding each other. And I also saw how, after a while, actually, the identity and the behavior of all three species, human, sheep, and dog, becomes quite merged. In fact, it turns out that the livestock guardian dog is the only animal on Earth, apparently, that has a triple identity. It identifies with other dogs, the gang. This is the canine identity. It identifies with the sheep that it has to guard. And often, dogs lick the sheep, especially newborn lambs. They lick them like they're their own puppies. And thirdly, it identifies with the humans. It's a triple identity. It's really complex. And then with time, I saw that the shepherd, also the true shepherd, also identifies in some way with the sheep and the dogs. You have to. You end up smelling the same. You are immediately licked by the dogs. You have to smell like them. There's no point washing during the day. If you wash, you're no longer part of the gang, because smell and movement and territory and synchronized movement is what it's about. Like in a family, like in a family with young children.
What you say in the book, the animals were in the middle, the humans were on the periphery. We served the animals so they could serve us, so we could serve them.
Yeah, it's the interdependence. It just changes your perspective on the human world. It just makes you realize, I had one day, it makes you realize how much more interesting it is to be a part of that living web, to be just a component. There's one writer, actually, she's a Pan-American pastoralist who wrote a book about her travels around Europe visiting out other pastoralists. It's called Brave and Loyal, and actually her book is dedicated. She's not a writer, but she's written a beautiful book about this, Brave and Loyal, about the guardian dogs that make this possible still in North America and in Europe. And of course, all of the places she visited in Europe are Southeast Europe, Bulgaria. She actually visited this particular farm that I feature in Anima. Bulgaria, Turkey, Spain, Portugal, and France. That's where she visited pastoralists. And she describes this as we humans are just a component of the pastoral web. I had a day off, during my 2 or 3 weeks when we were still down at the second terrace of the mountain, which is where, the daily pastoral walks take place all year round. This is an all year round thing. There's no holidays with these animals. They have to be taken out every day. So for 2 or 3 weeks, I just shadowed the shepherd, the hired shepherd, taking them out to the sort of neighboring hills and bringing them back to base in the evening. And I had a day off, just one day off. And during that day, I rested, but I also felt really empty. I felt like I wasn't a component of anything anymore. I was just a free floating sort of, just a kind of lost atom in space. And I had no mission. And I experienced, what it feels to be disconnected from the living web. And that's when I decided that I was going to spend time, when we took the animals up to higher pasture, which was, of course, the whole purpose of experiencing this and writing about is actually taking them up for the summer to the summit. I decided I was going to try and live there for as long as possible, at the highest terrace of the mountain. And it's important to stress how few people do this now. It's only a few people in this mountain, and maybe a few dozen people generally. Actually, I couldn't put a number on it, but it's a kind of endangered practice now to take your animals up to higher pastures, because you need the resources, you need the hired shepherds, you need the dogs, you need the summer pens and the winter pens for the animals, you need to negotiate pasture with whoever owns the place. And in this case, the summer pasture fell within the grounds of the confines of the Pirin National Park. So it was a question of the pastoralists negotiating with the administration, the hostile administration of the national park. And I witnessed firsthand, and from the point of view of the shepherds, of the of the farmers, this conflict between very tourist-oriented sort of head counting, administration of the national park, who don't want the pastoralists there. And on the other hand, the pastoral viewpoint, we need these pastures for our animals, but also, the overarching point of, and ecologists agree with this, that actually a healthy mountain biosphere of the kind of that, that I am describing here, needs grazing animals.
Yeah, so why can't they coexist?
They can.
The hiking trails are quite high
Yes,
up. They run along the ridge tops where there's nothing to eat anyway.
they absolutely can coexist. And in fact, they have coexisted for a long time. There is a kind of culture clash between this sort of rather new and very blinkered understanding from tourist authorities that it should be open to, it should all be about hikers, how many hikers and how many tourists have visited our national park this year. It's number crunching, and it's the bureaucratic approach to nature, which is actually doing the damage. And that, in fact, they can coexist. There are strict rules about, for example, if you have a flock of sheep with guardian dogs, there is a strict rule about, you have to be, 200 meters away from the nearest hiking trail, so that, your dogs don't approach hikers. Sometimes, hikers get freaked out by the dogs because these are large dogs. Sometimes they bark. It's their job. But it's very rare to be attacked by a guardian dog.
Especially if you're sensible and you don't go wandering into the middle of a flock of sheep, or, the hikers should be educated
Yes.
about this as well.
Yes, I think that's exactly it. I think hikers, there have been cases of hikers who play with these dogs, and you don't play with a Karakachan dog. They don't know you. So you're quite right. It's about education, and it's really interesting, witnessing this sort of conflict from. I witnessed it from the pastoral point of view, and I also saw on the ground itself. I saw the result of insufficient grazing of the land, put it that way, a land which actually, for hundreds of years had this moving grazing sort of pattern, and it creates what I think ecologists call this a mosaic biosphere or a mosaic landscape, which is a healthy thing. It's good. You want to have a mosaic landscape as opposed to a monoculture where there's just one thing growing, like, I don't know, just broom growing or just gorse, like it does in the Highlands of Scotland. There's, just one or two invasive species. And actually, in the case of Pirin, the lower terraces of Pirin are invaded by Greek juniper because an artificial national park or an artificial sort of Greek juniper reserve was created by the communist authorities in the 50s. So they started, in a typical industrial sort of way, they started separating one species from another, saying, over here we have Greek juniper. Over there you can graze your animals, but not over here. And this started, initiated the breakdown of a natural sort of diverse biosphere. And I saw the results of that on the ground. And actually, what moving pastoralism gives to the mountain is precisely this mosaic biosphere where they graze over here one summer, but then they leave that area and the area recovers naturally. Native species grow back, and then next summer they graze over there. And that ensures diversity. And I think we need to understand that so that we don't see grazing animals as a threat. It's all about scale.
And one of the great things, speaking as someone who enjoys hiking, one of the great things about visiting this corner of the world is that you can encounter these cultures, and you can still, if you bump into a shepherd or see these people, and experience a culture that you can't in Western Europe. I spent a couple weeks walking through the accursed mountains from the Rugova Gorge in Kosovo to Montenegro and Albania and back to Kosovo. And I would often encounter shepherds there, and these massive dogs that I think they were called Sarplaninac. Is that any relation to the Karakachan dog?
Yes, yeah. What are they called? Sharplaninets.
That's it. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, those dogs which are in Macedonia and Albania, they called that after the Shar Planina, the Shar Mountains, which I believe are just south of the so-called accursed mountain.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
They are similar looking, very bearish, fiercely intelligent dogs, phenomenal intelligence. So they do have some affinity, absolutely, in their behavior. And again, they were bred by Highlanders, over a long period of time. And I think both those breeds, the Sharplaninets and the Karakachan, hail from what is today Tibet, from the Asian steppes, and they came apparently with, nobody knows when these breeds came and how they evolved in the Balkans, which they did, but they came over with armies and tradesmen and communities migrating from Central Asia into the Balkans.
And the dogs take on quite a distinctive character in the book as well. What was the name? There was an older dog. He was quite a stoical, fiercely, just constantly focused on his job.
Balkan.
What was his name? I'm trying to find it.
Balkan, who was the
Balkan,
Tartar,
yes,
as the shepherd described him. He was the head dog, and Balkan was always embedded in the flock. So Balkan was in the middle of the flock, whereas the other dogs were on the periphery, because they all have roles and a pecking order. Of course, the challenge, when you have these dogs, is how to create a real leader and a real kind of, the next Balkan, if you like. A lot of the dogs are simply there to herd and watch the sheep, and they're not necessarily going to actively protect from a wolf attack. And, this is wolf territory. Only, 2 or 3 of the male dogs will actively fight wolves. And of course, there's bears as well. And once upon a time, and I kept hearing this from people there, once upon a time, actually not so long ago, more like a generation or two ago, there were, the Karakachan breed of dog was much stronger, and because shepherding was still a kind of mass activity, and because these animal cities were still in the mountain, I call them animal cities, tens of thousands of grazing animals with dogs and sheep, they were actually able to fight bears as well. There was a bear up in the alpine hut. There was a bear that sort of prowled around the summer pen, and the dogs were afraid of her. It was a female bear, and I was afraid as well. You face some of your fears in this sort of environment, and it was exhilarating and challenging and not at all romantic. So, I don't want to romanticize it. I would say that perhaps the saddest thing and the most difficult and painful thing that I experienced and I witnessed is the slow death of this way of life. And I still have hope that, there is a way forward with this. But people need to know about it. Young people, I want young people to know, to read my book and know that this is a possible way of life, at least seasonally, that you can learn. You can learn to live with animals, to shepherd animals too. This is the only humane way forward I think, for livestock, for grazing animals. This is the alternative to industrial farming, which is horrendous. Industrial farming, we should continue challenging it. We should continue, recognizing that it's an inhumane practice on such a large industrial scale, that large scale industry, animal industry has no future, and that we should just be returning back to this smaller scale, humane, ecological, free moving pastoral way. It's also the healthiest way for us. That is where the healthiest food comes from, and our governments should encourage these people.
Well, I think you do see a shift towards more interest in traditional ways of life as our current lifestyle becomes more and more technologically dependent, more and more disconnected, and often some ether that nobody's very happy to live in anymore. You see a lot of it's called neo-traditionalism or something like this, looking back for deeper meaning in the past as the technological feature becomes increasingly empty or devoid of meaning, more convenient but devoid of meaning, I think. But it's quite a harsh way of life. I mean, so how was life there different from what you'd experienced? Like life in the higher pastures, how was that different from what you'd experienced in the lowlands?
Well, the difference is that you have no phone signal, or you have just a couple of places where you get phone signal, so you're not reliant. You can't rely on communication. And it's a basic way of life, but a lot of people pay a lot of money to go and experience a basic way of life like that. Living in a hut in a pristine environment, or almost pristine. It's a form of survivalism, but not in any kind of retrograde or reactionary way. It's a form of healthy survivalism where you actually learn about yourself, you learn about the people that you share it with, you learn about the animals, you learn about predators. You learn about what really matters in life. You learn about nature, plants, what you do in a storm. You learn to tell the time without having a clock, if you run out of battery. And yes, it was difficult, but I would say that, it doesn't have to be as difficult as what I experienced. If there is more support, from the authorities, or more subsidies, or generally more understanding in the mainstream culture of what pastoralists do. If there is more support, then they wouldn't be so isolated and so kind of pushed to the edge. You are always walking, when you're in wilderness, you are always to an extent walking on the razor's edge, because that's the nature of wilderness. But you wouldn't have to be walking that kind of razor's edge where you are looked down on as a pariah or as a threat to tourism. That is manufactured, that it doesn't have to be that way. And indeed, in Switzerland, for example, I've seen a different approach to pastoralism. When it's a celebrated part of culture to this day, around this time, actually, mid-June, farmers take the cattle up, the cows up to higher pasture. And it's a day of celebration or a week of celebration, they're festooned with flowers and the community goes up to higher pasture, and there is pride attached to that, healthy pride. And there is support from the local authorities and support from the local communities. And that is, I think, the way forward, where, the milk is valued as well, and the cheese, these crafted cheeses are valued and sold at proper prices. Whereas in the Balkans, although actually the Balkans are the last sort of bastion of pastoralism of this kind, it's very debased because of all the trauma that has happened, with communism and post-communism. It's a very debased way of life, and shepherds are debased, and they're often alcoholics, and they're often coming from, the Roma slums, gypsy backgrounds, and or former sort of vagrants, and, or simply local people who are clinging to this way of life out of love, out of loyalty, out of that deep understanding that it matters. It matters to keep doing this, even if nobody says bravo, It matters to keep milking sheep by hand and producing the cleanest milk and cheese in the world and selling it to just your neighbors. But the heartening thing is that, and I kept hearing this from the sheep people and the goat people in the area, who do sell locally because they can't place their products in the shops because there are regulations that disencourage small scale producers like this and encourage large scale industrial farming, in fact. So regulations need to change. But I kept hearing from the people, in the book, that there's increased demand, increased interest in organic milk, goat's milk and sheep's milk. And that actually in the last few years, there's been a real jump in interest, and they can barely keep up with demand. So that's very heartening.
That's one of the things that stood out most for me. Driving down the roads in Bulgaria, you would just come across a guy with a table with his produce set out and some cheese that he had obviously made at home, and some honey, and drive around another bend and there'd be another guy over there next to the freshest water you could ever taste coming out of a pipe on the mountainside. Why can't these people be selling for higher prices in shops rather than trucking in food from far away? It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense. And I saw that close up, that actually, why do we have to wait for a pandemic or a hideous war, to disrupt our supply chains, and then start frantically looking for what's locally available? Why can't we do this the intelligent way and start looking for what's locally available when it still is, and when there are still people putting their heart and soul and body and health and every single penny they have into keeping these practices going, and actually value them and go and look for them locally.
One of the things that I really enjoyed and that really stood out for me about the section of your time in the higher pasture was how it turned you in on yourself. So you talked about the exhaustion of the endless tasks and the constant privation and the isolation and the way it turns you inwards and cuts you off from the world below. You said, it's not the bear behind the hut or the wolves at the perimeter. It's not the storm or the cold. It's the void. I am inside a void, and there is a void inside me.
Yeah. In the wilderness, you face the void, and it's if you haven't faced the void, then you haven't really experienced wilderness. The void is both inside and outside, and that's one of the things I explore in my writing. And I think it came to a kind of Anima is a high point in my exploration. how the inside of the psyche, how the human psyche and the psyche of the land are actually one uninterrupted whole, and how the inner becomes outer and vice versa. You experience that best when you are not surrounded by other humans. And that episode, when I faced the void that you just mentioned, was a particularly kind of harsh point in the whole sort of in the whole experience, where it was just me and the hired shepherd up in the alpine pastures, and by this time we'd become very close, and we were literally the whole world for each other up there. And his name is Sasho, and Sasho said to me from the beginning, wait until we go up there. This was still in the second terrace of the mountain. You live if the animals live, and you die if they die. And I sort of laughed, and then I realized it was quite true. There was a stormy night, when he went looking for the flock. The flock had sort of veered off and gone out of view, and he didn't return. And I spent a part of the night, in this sort of in extreme conditions, in a storm, not knowing if he was dead or alive, and not being able to help him. And that's when I faced the void. And I faced the void at other points as well, because the shepherds drank a lot, and I found myself very alone and feeling very unsafe. Facing the void is something we should all do. Otherwise, we'll never know ourselves. And it's a gift. It was a gift, all of that experience, to really know what you're made of.
You have a long passage about Carl Jung that touches on this. Kind of midway through the book, you say, once I went through a period where living with symbols appeared in my dream, and a voice said, I am animus. They take the shape of moving images and infuse all of our relationships. They're part of the contents of the collective psyche, but they have an autonomous life, which mean that anima and animus would exist even if humanity didn't. And these kind of realizations coming to you on the mountains, I've always had trouble wrapping my head around that. I can understand some sort of collective unconscious or some passing down of tribal memory, but how it could exist outside of humanity. Like, is it akin to Plato's forms, or is it outside of humanity in the sense of not being limited to our type of animal, something common to all animals, and something that we can only touch by getting back to fundamentals like you did on the mountainside?
There is something about wilderness where the contents of your psyche take a literal form, while at the same time remaining symbolic. And I experienced that. And there was a child up there there were 2 huts in the alpine pastures, in Blackwater. That's what that valley is known as, as Blackwater. There was a child there, Constantine. And I had these almost sort of, I had these philosophical conversations with him. He was a kind of prodigy, a gifted child, whose mother was a hired shepherdess. Again, people coming from very deprived backgrounds. And this child just was there. And we were having platonic dialogues, at the top of the mountain, looking at the rock faces, talking about life and death. And he said to me at one point, he was 10 years old, do you feel like there were lots of people here once, as if the mountain is a giant house, and now there aren't any people, and the house is empty? And Constantine was there through all the crises that we went through, and he was at times the only real adult. So things like that. And he was the archetype, really. He was the archetype of the poet, but also the archetype of the sage, the precocious sage. And I was very grateful to him, because we were a support for each other. And so what I loved about that experience, and what I missed, was how the symbolic and the literal merged.
Do symbols like archetypes come more easily to people living traditional lives close to the land? Like, have we simply lost touch with such things in Silicon civilization?
I think we have, but we can regain it. We can reclaim it. I learned skills in just a few weeks that I didn't know I could have, like how to live with 600 sheep, sleeping next to them, how to milk a goat, how to understand why sheep lay down in the evening. It's because it's going to rain the next day. We can reclaim how to tell the time, whether it's 4 or 4:30, in the afternoon, without reaching for a device. We can reclaim these skills. And there is something, I think, really important in the word that we can learn from the word transhumance, which is exactly what this story is about. It's another word for pastoralism. And transhumance literally means moving across the land, which is the exact opposite of transhumanism, this very new concept that people now recognize more than they recognize transhumans. Transhumanism is the dehumanization of ourselves and the surrendering of our powers to silicon devices, to AI, to what is disembodied. And there is something very poignant about that dichotomy. Are we going to choose transhumance, living in the land which we are a part of, or are we going to choose transhumanism, which is where we surrender, we give up our essence in favor of a silicon chip. And for me, it's not even necessarily one or the other. We can have both in a healthy way, because we are organic beings. We are biological beings and we are spiritual beings. And I think a pastoralist, or someone who spends time in nature, or someone who spends more time with animals, understands that better, both the biological and the spiritual, understands that better than a banker or an AI specialist who is immersed in this human monoculture called anthropos.
It's amazing how deep in our psyche this is embedded as well. Did you ever come across a book called The Sheltering Desert?
No.
It's by a guy called Henno Martin. It's set in Namibia. It's about a geologist or a pair of geologists who were living in Namibia at the outbreak of war, and they were afraid of being interned by the British, so they just took off into the wilderness, and they hid out in the desert, just kind of outside of Windhoek. It's about a half a day's drive outside of Windhoek in this canyon. And they hid out there for several years, and they talked about having to learn to live off the land and survive out there, because these guys were engineers. They didn't have any skills like this. But one of the parts of the book that I could never forget is how they started to have hunting dreams. They began to dream of animals and of hunting, and it took on kind of the appearance of cave paintings. This is exactly the same sorts of scenes were coming to them in their dreams as they became more and more in touch with the land and with living in this way.
Yes, indeed, because the outside becomes the inside. And the life of the psyche is very malleable. Our psyches are very malleable. And I think it's in situations like that you understand how much your psyche, as well as your body, is a part of the environment. Because we forget that in an urban environment, we forget it. And in a more natural environment, we become more like animals. We become attuned to the environment. And then the environment ultimately enters us. And then ultimately we experience oneness. And of course, that's what all the ancient, all the mystical and spiritual traditions train the human being to break down the boundary of the ego and experience oneness with all of creation. And you don't need to be a sadhu, or a yogi or whatever, to be meditating all day to experience that in wilderness. I think wilderness, or even just a patch of undisturbed sort of undergrowth by your local river, can provide that if you spend long enough, in that environment.
Well, you've got a really beautiful passage here too about descending back to the lower world and becoming disconnected from this yet again. And your poetic sensibilities really come out here. You say that the room smells of chemical detergent and makes you sick. You order a feast of 5 salads, hungry for fresh vegetables, but you can't eat much unless you walk. Walking along the flat road doesn't feel like walking. Your body has changed. Your perceptions have changed. You scan the perimeter for signs, but all you find is people moving in and out of doorways, chairs, and cars. It is a blank, horizontal world. Everything feels disconnected, like neurons firing at random without quite making up a brain. People look like they've lost something, but what is it? A blanket of ignorance covers the world.
Yeah, that was my experience of when I came down from the high pastures. And I think it's simply the monotony of anthropos that I experienced, but in a very stark way, because I had experienced the full aliveness of the living web, where I was a component of something. And in the world of anthropos, increasingly, actually, I don't feel like I am a component of anything. I am just a lonely neuron firing at random, and I seek for something to connect with. And I think we're all like that. It's just that we end up connecting with our devices most of the time because that's what's at hand. And that gives us an illusion of connectedness. But it is neither biological nor spiritual. It is just a mental connectedness. And as all the spiritual traditions will tell you, and I do have an interest in spirituality, which I explored in my previous book more explicitly, as all the spiritual traditions tell you, the mind is full of illusion. The mind creates illusion. So any sense of mental connectedness alone ends up being illusory and unsatisfactory. We are meant to also connect bodily and spiritually, I think, if we are to be fulfilled.
Yeah, that's something you say in a later section of the book too. I see that most of what we do is try to fill something that can't be filled. Most of our time is spent like this.
Yeah, the materialism of our culture,
Trying to fill that void.
trying to fill a hole. And they say one of the definitions of madness is keep doing the same thing and expecting different results. And we need to change our ways, don't we? We need to radically change our ways. And I had a radical experience in Anima. And in my previous book, I had a radical experience among the plant people. And I am now sort of feeling more and more, environmentally radical. We need to break with certain habits. It's about what we give up, isn't it? We need to give up certain things.
Or stop chasing the wrong things.
But yeah, stop chasing the wrong things. Absolutely.
So your work deals with the relationships of place and people. You explored the story of your own family's past in Border and Into the Lake, your book on Ohrid in Macedonia, at the personal level, in other words. And your next two books dealt with the societal level, in a sense, like how people in this corner of the Balkans connected with the natural world, the world of plants in Elixir and the world of animals in Anima. So what's next? Will you continue to write about this region?
This is now complete. My Balkan quartet is complete. And I'm now working on a body of work which is set in Scotland. And I continue to explore the intimate relationship between people and place, including my own intimate relationship with the Glen, the Scottish Glen, where I've lived for the last while, and looking at how places change. And this is going to be a more activist angle actually going forward, because I have witnessed the industrialization of the Scottish Highlands, and I'm writing about that now and why that is not necessary and that is not the way forward, and a continuation really of the themes of Anima, but in a Scottish context.
I look forward to that. Well, you'll have to come back and we'll talk about that when it's ready. So thank you for your time today, Kapka. I love the Balkans, and it's such a fascinating corner of Europe, and I value your books for showing me some of this region's uniqueness.
Thank you, Ryan. And I think you actually you climbed Thunder Peak, which I was looking at, for weeks and weeks with the sheep and the dogs, but never got to the top of. So I like thinking of you being there, looking down at us.
Yeah, we may have been there at the same time. We may have been glancing at each other from a distance. Well, it's nice to finally see you much closer up.
Thank you, Ryan. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.